By now, the story of João Manuel has moved from the quiet confines of his gilded cage to the tumultuous, restless reign of his son, Sebastian. And yet, even in Sebastian's bold actions and tragic disappearance, the shadow of João Manuel lingers, subtle but persistent. When Sebastian vanished in 1578 at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, Portugal faced a profound crisis. The country suddenly found itself without a clear, direct heir. Remember that João Manuel had only lived a short 16 years, just long enough to produce Sebastian. And now, the cycle of dynastic fragility repeated itself. The nation teetered on the edge of uncertainty, wondering who would take the throne and whether the empire could continue its trajectory unbroken. The throne passed temporarily to Cardinal Henry, Sebastian's great-uncle. Henry was elderly, conservative, and importantly, celibate, a man who could not provide a lasting line. The Portuguese court found itself in a delicate balancing act: maintain the monarchy, secure alliances, and prevent foreign powers from swooping in. It was a subtle, tense period of political limbo, reminiscent in many ways of the quiet fragility that had defined João Manuel's life. Interestingly, João Manuel's story continues to ripple through this period. His life had been so fragile and constrained that the survival of his child became a linchpin for Portugal's stability. And now, with Sebastian gone, the very dynasty that João Manuel had quietly safeguarded for a brief moment was vulnerable again. It's almost poetic in a very gentle, slightly ironic way. A prince in a cage, whose short life had ensured continuity, indirectly shaped the trajectory of Portugal decades later. Meanwhile, abroad, European powers watched closely. Spain, in particular, had a vested interest in Portugal's throne, and it's easy to imagine the whispers. Remember João Manuel? He was frail, yes, but he gave us Sebastian. Now the line is fragile again. Perhaps it's time for intervention. In other words, João Manuel's genetic and physical fragility created long-term consequences that no one at the time could fully appreciate. Inside Portugal, the people continued their lives, largely unaware of the delicate interplay behind palace walls. Merchants traded spices, ships sailed to Brazil and India, and Lisbon thrummed with wealth and activity. Yet the undercurrent of dynastic anxiety persisted. The court was haunted not just by the absence of Sebastian, but the memory of João Manuel, a prince who could have easily died before producing an heir, whose confinement and frailty had almost derailed an entire succession. And then came the eventual resolution. Portugal's throne passed to Philip II of Spain, uniting the Iberian crowns in a personal union. While this ended some immediate succession crises, it also highlighted the long-term consequences of João Manuel's brief life. A fragile prince, confined and protected, had set the stage for a chain of events that ultimately reshaped national identity and sovereignty. All this, quietly, without ever raising an army or signing a treaty. There's a gentle irony in all this. João Manuel's life seems insignificant in the larger sweep of history. He never ruled, never marched into battle, never made speeches or decrees. And yet, by existing just long enough to produce an heir, by living a life of extreme fragility, he indirectly influenced the fates of kings, nations, and empires. History, it seems, sometimes moves not through the loud and the powerful, but through the subtle and constrained. Even in death, João Manuel remained a symbol of both caution and potential. His life serves as a quiet reminder that fragility can be both protective and consequential, that the simplest act, surviving childhood, producing an heir, can ripple through decades and reshape entire kingdoms. And as we drift toward the close of this chapter, consider the broader lesson here. Royalty is often viewed through the lens of spectacle, coronations, battles, marriages, and intrigues. But João Manuel's story, so understated and quiet, reminds us that history also flows through the lives of those who never wield power in the conventional sense. Sometimes the prince in a cage leaves a mark far deeper than the boldest king. So, as we gently float through the echoes of João Manuel's life, we see a pattern: fragility, protection, expectation, and consequence. Each element subtly influences the next generation, shaping choices, policies, and the very survival of dynasties. It's a quiet, almost sleepy sort of history, but one with profound implications. And that, in the end, is the story of João Manuel, a prince who lived in a cage, never ruling in the traditional sense, yet leaving a legacy that shaped Portugal in ways both immediate and far-reaching. His life is a testament to the strange, ironic, and quiet ways in which history unfolds, a reminder that even the most constrained lives can leave ripples that extend far beyond the walls that contain them. And as we settle into the final part of our journey through João Manuel's life, it's worth taking a deep, slow breath and reflecting on the quiet, subtle power of fragility. João Manuel, the prince who lived in a cage, may seem at first glance to be a minor footnote in history, but as we've seen, his existence rippled through generations, quietly shaping the fate of Portugal. His life, brief and constrained, was defined by fragility. From birth, he was weak, prone to illness, and constantly monitored. The Portuguese court, obsessed with the survival of its dynastic line, treated him almost as an artifact rather than a child, delicate, precious, and dangerously vulnerable. And yet, that very fragility created a story of unintended consequences. By surviving childhood and producing his son Sebastian, João Manuel ensured that the Aviz dynasty continued. But his confinement, illness, and early death also created a vacuum of example. Sebastian, energetic and ambitious, inherited the psychological weight of a father he barely knew, shaped in subtle ways by the cautionary tale of João Manuel's life. It is a delicate irony. The more fragile the father, the more audacious the son. Sebastian's disappearance in Morocco decades later reopened the dynastic fragility that João Manuel had briefly bridged. Portugal was thrust into uncertainty, eventually leading to the Iberian Union under Philip II of Spain. João Manuel never saw any of this unfold, yet his brief life in a cage indirectly set the stage for these events. It's a quiet, almost ghostly form of influence, like a shadow stretching across generations. There's something profoundly human in this story. João Manuel's life reminds us that history is not always driven by bold, decisive action. Sometimes it moves through the quiet, constrained, and fragile, those who never wield power conventionally, but whose existence and survival shape everything that follows. It's a reminder that even the smallest, most delicate life can have outsized consequences. And let's not forget the gentle absurdity of it all. A prince confined to a chamber, never fully engaging with the world, ends up leaving a mark that echoes across decades. There's irony here, soft but unmistakable. The life least capable of action becomes the seed for historical drama. João Manuel also serves as a lens through which we can view the peculiarities of dynastic politics. Royal families often acted in ways that seem strange or cruel to us today, isolating fragile children, orchestrating marriages with close relatives, obsessing over succession. These measures, designed to protect the lineage, often created their own set of problems. João Manuel's life is the quiet embodiment of this pattern. He was protected, constrained, and carefully monitored, and yet those very measures highlight the fragility and unpredictability of human life, even in the gilded halls of power. As we gently float toward the end of this story, consider João Manuel not as a tragic footnote, but as a quiet, almost meditative illustration of history's subtler currents. He reminds us that power is not always about action or conquest. Sometimes it is about survival, about existing just long enough to ensure the continuation of a line, and about influencing the next generation in ways that are indirect but profound. His life was short, yes, just 16 years, but those 16 years contained lessons in fragility, care, and the subtle interplay between human limitation and historical consequence. João Manuel's cage was both literal and symbolic, a protective boundary that contained his body, but whose echoes stretched far beyond its walls. So, as you slowly drift toward the end of this story, remember João Manuel, the prince in a cage. His life was gentle, constrained, and quietly significant. It was filled with fragility, expectation, and irony, a delicate dance of survival that shaped generations. History in this instance moves not in grand gestures, but in quiet, almost imperceptible rhythms, and sometimes the smallest, most. As we settle in to the final stretch of João Manuel's story, it's worth letting the mind drift slowly over the long, quiet ripples of his life. A prince born fragile, confined, and closely watched, João Manuel may not have seemed like a figure of historical significance during his 16 years of life. And yet, as we followed him from his gilded cage to the reign and disappearance of his son Sebastian, it becomes clear that even the most constrained lives can leave lasting impressions. João Manuel's life is, in many ways, a meditation on fragility itself. He was delicate from birth, surrounded by attendants, tutors, and caretakers whose primary role was to protect him from a world that might be too harsh for his weak constitution. And while this overprotection may have prolonged his life just long enough to produce an heir, it also illustrates a broader truth. The constraints imposed on the fragile can sometimes highlight the absurdity of human ambition and expectation. His confinement, both literal and figurative, contrasts sharply with the bold, energetic life of his son Sebastian. Where João Manuel could barely step outside his chambers with concern, Sebastian would later charge into Morocco with a restless, almost desperate ambition. In this contrast, we see the subtle influence of history. A fragile life begets audacious action, and audacious action is in turn a response to fragility. And yet, the story is not only about audacity and fragility, it is also about legacy. João Manuel, despite his confinement, ensured the survival of the Alves dynasty through the birth of Sebastian. That single act, living just long enough to produce an heir, shaped the trajectory of Portugal for decades. Even the tragic consequences of Sebastian's disappearance, the dynastic uncertainty, and the eventual Iberian Union can all be traced, in a quiet, indirect way, back to the fragile prince who lived in a cage. There is, of course, a gentle irony here. João Manuel never held power in the traditional sense. He never led armies, enacted policies, or engaged in diplomatic negotiations. And yet, through the act of simply existing and surviving, he left an imprint that echoed far beyond his short life. It's a subtle reminder that influence does not always appear as dramatic action. Sometimes it is quiet, almost imperceptible, like a shadow stretching across time. As we reflect on João Manuel's life, we might also consider the broader patterns of dynastic history. Royal families often made choices that seem strange or even cruel today, isolating sickly children, orchestrating marriages with close relatives, and obsessively monitoring heirs. These measures were intended to protect the lineage, but they also created fragility in unexpected ways.
João Manuel's life embodies this paradox. He was preserved, yet vulnerable, protected, yet shaped by forces beyond his control. In this gentle meditation, we notice another layer. João Manuel's story illustrates the human dimensions of history, the anxiety, the expectation, the quiet pressures that shape lives in ways that are not always visible. While battles, treaties, and coronations dominate history books, the subtle influence of a fragile life like João Manuel's quietly directs the flow of events. It is, in a sleepy, reflective way, almost like observing the movement of a slow, deep current beneath a calm surface. So as you allow yourself to drift further into reflection, consider João Manuel, the prince who lived in a cage, who never ruled, who never left a dramatic mark in his own time, and yet whose fragile existence shaped the destiny of a nation. His story is quiet, ironic, and deeply human. It is a testament to the understated power of survival, the quiet shaping of legacy, and the sometimes unexpected ways in which history unfolds. And with this, we can gently let João Manuel rest in the soft folds of history. He was fragile, confined, and fleeting, yet his life endures in the whispers of palace halls, in the succession of kings, and in the subtle, ironic rhythms that govern dynasties. It is a story that moves slowly, quietly, and thoughtfully, much like the gentle passage of time itself. So as you close the tale, we leave behind the gilded cage, the delicate prince, and the echoes of a life that was at once constrained and consequential. And we carry forward the quiet understanding that even the briefest, most fragile existence can shape the world in profound and lasting ways. So dim the lights further, take a slow, deep breath, and let the story of João Manuel, the prince who lived in a cage, drift softly into your mind, leaving a gentle impression of history, fragility, and the quiet echoes of time.